Welcome everyone to Merton College, to this talk given as part of our series Merton Conversations in Faith and Culture, which brings in experts from various fields to help us engage with some of the biggest questions in our time and society, and to see what perspectives of faith perhaps might have to offer to these questions as well. This evening we're delighted to welcome Dr. Michael Burdett, who is a theologian and philosopher who began his career as a scientist working in aerospace and robotics. He is assistant professor of theology at the University of Nottingham, having previously worked at the universities of St Andrews and here in Oxford until this past year. He is the author of Eschatology and the Technological Future, Technology and the Rise of Transhumanism, Beyond Genetic Engineering, and most recently co-author of Finding Ourselves After Darwin, Conversations on the Image of God, Original Sin and the Problem of Evil. His talk this evening is Being Human in an Age of Technology, the Ethics of Artificial Intelligence. So please welcome Michael Burdett.
Well, many thanks to Merton College for inviting me here to speak to you today on a very interesting and pressing topic. Hopefully the numbers here aren't just because it's really cold outside and you want to stay warm, but perhaps it shows us something a bit more about our particular moment, our technological moment, and how we might respond to it today. Specific thanks to Father Jared Mercer for inviting me, and I look forward to the conversations and questions we'll have at the very end. Well, it's no secret that our world has become irrevocably transformed by technology today. The face of the earth speaks of these vast changes. Indeed, an image taken from an orbiting spacecraft would likely reveal tiny sparkling lights that originate from our cities. And even the Great Wall of China could be seen etching out parts of the landscape, revealing the very sublime scale of our technological achievements. Furthermore, the global trend towards increasing urbanization today shows that we are at this moment, more than likely, all of us, in the present company of more artificial objects than quote-unquote natural ones. Technology has moved from just a handful of useful objects that might make our lives easier to making up the central environment in which we dwell today. It seems to be everywhere. And this increase in technological proliferation and its impact on just about every area of human life raises significant ethical questions about how we ought to use this technology, and I think more radically, how we ought to live well and flourish in a society increasingly impacted by this technology. In fact, I think it's that latter, how we are to live well, that seems to be much more pressing than just the ethical uses of how we ought to use it. And I think we feel really conflicted today, don't we? We feel a sense of awe at what these technologies can achieve, from letting the deaf hear to sending us into these far reaches of outer space. And yet I think we also feel a strong sense of anxiety, that we are somehow being pulled along faster and faster and cannot control the sense of technological advancement, even when its promises are also met with failures and sacrifices along the way. How do we respond to these changes, and indeed these dramatic challenges? Well, I hope in my time together with you today, just flag up some of these radical changes and how we might begin to respond to them today. And in that short time that we have, I want to address 4 areas that require, I think, explicit ethical and personal attention today. And these particular topics are going to provide the structure and shape of what I'll be speaking about. So first look at gene editing, designer babies, and human enhancement. before turning to information technology and politics, and possibly the whole reason why you came, on artificial intelligence, robotics, and human relationships, and then technological use and personal formation. I also want to signal a warning up front. Very often we want to reduce the complexity of technological issues to something much more simplistic than it is actually possible. These are the kinds of responses I often get. The questions: is it a good technology or is it a bad technology, we might ask? Should I use it or shouldn't I use it? While these can be helpful initial questions when devising any contemporary ethics of technology and AI, frankly, it gets messy the deeper into you go. As you will come to see in each of these cases, neither is technology creating a clear dystopia, nor is it straightforwardly creating a utopia either. So let's turn to each in turn just to see what I mean here. Let's look at gene editing, designer babies, and human enhancement. Well, one of the most talked about areas of technological impact today, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, and the promises in recent years is gene editing, and the promises that it makes to not only transform our world around us, but even each of us from within. This level of biomedical transformation has really reached, I think, a kind of tipping point today. At no other time in the past have we had such direct influence and impact on our own personal, morphological, biological transformation. And much of this fervor around genetic engineering today is the product of a gene editing application I'm sure that maybe even some of you here work with, called CRISPR-Cas9, which was selected by the journal Science as the 2015 Breakthrough of the Year. Well, previous gene editing applications that were kind of popularized in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, like talons and zinc finger nucleases, while they certainly gave us access to genomic change, were much less reliable and much more expensive. CRISPR-Cas9, on the other hand, is cheap. According to prices about 3 or 4 years ago, was about 100 to 150 times cheaper than the others. It was more effective, so the kinds of applications that you wanted to come up with to actually make the change on the site on the genome would be more efficacious in making that actually possible, and was more universal. The kinds of applications that you'd create for one particular organism was much more translatable into other organisms as well. Well, with such fine-grained access to the genome comes the ability to alter the phenotype and morphology of any biological organism, and that includes us, humans. Altering the human genome can institute phenotypic changes that could alter capacities, for instance, that might shape personhood directly. Single gene traits or single gene diseases are the kind of lowest hanging fruit when it comes to gene editing, for the simple reason that a change at one site on the genome will change the specific trait or disease. This could mean creating therapies for debilitating diseases like Huntington's, sickle cell anemia, and cystic fibrosis. But others have speculated that changes on no more than 10 sites on the human genome could lead to, for example, bones that break surgical drills, a severe reduction in the risk of heart disease, and even Alzheimer's. In the long term, if we really take a kind of long view of this, it's not difficult to see that things like perhaps memory, behavior, and sociality could be some of the things that are drastically impacted by gene editing. But with such far-ranging advances in medical technology comes an equally difficult set of ethical issues that often impact human dignity. Just because we can create technologies that transform the human body doesn't mean we ought to in each instance. For instance, it's now possible to extract stem cells from human embryos for the sake of crafting very effective regenerative therapies. But should we do so knowing that it might damage or destroy the human embryos entirely? Similarly, advancements in genetics have made it possible to change the expressed characteristics of our future progeny through things like human germline modification. I don't know if anybody has seen in the news about the Chinese scientist who, even though there's an international agreement that you weren't to change the human germline, actually ended up doing this and has brought several gene-edited babies to term. This has all happened in the last couple of months. Similarly, advancements, but ought this biomedical procedure be available to everyone, even if it's used for non-therapeutic aims like changing height, hair color, or even intelligence? So the kinds of applications we're using it for seems to me to be really paramount when it comes to adjudicating the different ethical issues. And indeed, these issues take on a kind of new sense of urgency when gene editing is applied for human enhancement purposes rather than just for therapeutic ones. Simply put, therapies are used to bring people back to a healthy existence because they are sick or have some other condition that compromises their health. But enhancements make people, as Julian Savulescu has said, better than good by applying things like gene editing to already healthy individuals. So gene editing could be used to help combat cancer, and hence it's therapeutic. But it could also be used to enhance the individuals by making them potentially taller or more intelligent. It's clear that therapeutic uses of gene editing are universally accepted so long as they are safe, effective, and distributed equally and universally. But what about using gene editing for human enhancement purposes? Well, advocates of human enhancement will tell you that you ought to let people do whatever they can to be happy, and that enhancements can certainly do just that. Who wouldn't want to be a little smarter, a little bit faster, or live a little bit longer, or perhaps a lot smarter, a lot faster, or live a lot longer? However, detractors claim that one might be playing God or upset the natural order of things by doing so, that introducing enhancements into society will invariably lead to a greater inequality where the rich gain access to the best enhancements and the poor get left behind. The poor get biologically poor, not just financially poor. Religious people are divided over this issue as well, where some claim we have a moral responsibility to be co-creators with God by helping to redeem creation and even contribute to our own glory, whereas other Christians say it's a boundary that just shouldn't be crossed, that tampering with human nature undermines our dignity. The issue becomes even more complex when we consider altering the germline, changing the genes of all future generations. What a massive responsibility that could have all kinds of unintended consequences if used too quickly. And some have said leads to even instrumentalizing our children, treating them as resources for our desires and whims, not as our children, persons of their own value and worth. But what if we could eradicate cystic fibrosis or Huntington's disease forever? Shouldn't we at least consider it? Well, these issues are anything but straightforward. We aren't clearly undermining human society and personal development with gene editing, nor are we clearly ushering in the best of all possible worlds either. All right, well now let's turn to information technology in politics. I think we all recognize that technology has become a major political force today. It's almost silly to even say that's the case, whereas I can tell you almost 10 years ago when I had to make these arguments, they had to be real arguments to convince people. And this is particularly apparent in the role of information technology and the way it's played, and the role it's played in political revolutions and in the organizing of people for political purposes. Consider the case of Lucia Mendezabal and the Renuncia Ya, the Resign Now campaign in Guatemala. It is a story about how a Guatemalan grandmother's political rants on social media contributed to the toppling of a corrupt government's officials. In April 2015, several Guatemalan officials were accused of taking bribes, and this scandal, referred to as La Línea, went as high as Vice President Roxana Baldetti. This event was the final straw for many concerned citizens, even though they were accustomed to government corruption after the Civil War ended in 1996. Well, Mendes-Zabal notes how many on the Facebook group, Politically Incorrect, were considering voiding their ballots. Mendes-Zabal considered this retreat from public engagement deeply troubling and unsatisfying. She said in a kind of off-the-cuff post on Facebook that they should instead protest at the government palace itself and demand the resignation of Vice President Roxana Baldetti. Mendes-Zabal had no idea how this post would set off a chain reaction and develop a life of its own. In fact, she never had led a protest before, and she fully expected that someone with more political experience would notice the kind of momentum developing online and would mobilize the group. This did not happen. And, at the risk of her own personal safety, she led the online mobilization in spite of having never met any of the protesters in person. On the day of the protest, as she entered the square, she saw tens of thousands of protesters demanding the resignation of both the president and the vice president. 2 weeks later, the president announced that Roxana Baldetti had resigned. As Gabriel Torres notes from BBC Mundo, in a matter of days, Renuncia Ya achieved something almost unheard of in Latin America, a peaceful movement organized online which achieved real results. It was precisely this ease of mobilization that social media and information technology brings to modern politics that makes our current political moment so unique in political history. Indeed, Mendes-Zabal's experience is not unique, nor even probably the most visible political upheaval to be aided by information technology. Consider the Arab Spring. Taking place between 2010 and 2012, I'm sure you all remember, the Arab Spring refers to the series of revolutionary protests, riots, civil wars in countries like Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Syria. And journalists would often remark during these uprisings that the quintessential picture of the revolutionaries was an upraised arm in protest with a smartphone in hand. And the picture seems fitting, given that so much of what defined these revolutions was the grassroots nature of social and political activism, which relied so heavily on social media to organize the resistance and disseminate the oppressive atrocities to the rest of the world outside of it. Since that time, there's been great speculation, and indeed social scientific studies devoted to the actual influence of things like Twitter and Facebook in political coups and the real toppling of dictatorial regimes. And final analysis by those on the ground has shown that information technology did help to mobilize protests and political action in some local situations, for instance, Facebook with Tunisia. But it was often the dissemination of political events on social media, both to those in the country and outside of it, that made such a significant difference to these revolutions. Indeed, many oppressive regimes actively sought to close down public gatherings and nascent online activity, thus revealing how important virtual communication and dissent was to these rebellions. So not only has information technology become an important political consideration because it's been used to actually organize people for political dissent, as we saw with the Renuncia Ya movement, it's also important because of the way it democratizes communication and information when political powers seek to control their constituents through subterfuge, misdirection, and silencing of speech. And yet, while many other examples could be cited where information technology has enabled genuine political goods, in more recent times, I think we've become awakened to the fact that it needn't do so. It can actually be an agent of suppression and injustice. Consider how the Chinese and North Korean governments limit access and communication via the internet to those within their borders. If you happen to travel to, for example, Beijing, China, and want to access your Google email account, you will find you won't be able to do so. This has allowed local Chinese tech companies to spring up in the absence of the competition of their international counterparts. So you have Alibaba for Amazon, or Tencent for Facebook, or Baidu for Google, or Youku for YouTube. And this certainly has meant that China itself can reap the benefits of the economic development instead of shipping it abroad. However, the technocratic control that the Chinese government and North Korean governments have can often be incredibly frightening. Aside from obviously limiting dissenting political voices by literally shutting down blog sites and other journalistic sources that don't fall into line, the Chinese government has just instituted a social credit system. If you have seen a recent episode of the celebrated British television series Black Mirror, you might be privy to the concept of others scoring, liking, and ranking each other's social and business interactions. I mean, not unlike what we do today on social media or business sites, right, like Yelp. But China is literally experimenting with giving individual people reputational scores, which, if it drops too low, could lead to consequences such as banning you from flying or getting on a train, throttling your internet speeds, banning you and your kids from the best schools, or being publicly named as a bad citizen. The most egregious thing is not knowing how these scores are completely tabulated and could ruin someone's life completely, as actually the episode of the Black Mirror episode was really all about. Of course, many more examples could be cited where information technology and politics meet. Hacker manifestos, the WikiLeaks scandals, and more recently, Cambridge Analytica feeding targeted information over social media to influence the Brexit vote here in Britain and the election of Donald Trump to the American presidency. This new power of information technology can be used for Orwellian suppression of freedom of speech, like China and North Korea. It can provide a platform for the oppressed when none other exists, as we see with the Arab Spring, or it can be used to conduct political partisan warfare, as we've seen with Brexit in the 2016 American election. We find that sizing up the social and political impact of information technology is neither explicitly a complete gain for humanity, nor is it clearly a diminishment of it either. Rather, the aims, purposes, and already existing power structures often amplify what already exists for good or for ill. Well, so much for information technology and politics. Let's turn to the third area that I want to talk about, which is artificial intelligence, robotics, and human relationships. Well, in one way or another, we're being told that AI is going to transform our lives in the next several decades. I've heard many tech experts say that it will overhaul the fabric of our businesses as much as electricity did some several hundred years ago. And most public attention seems to focus on the ethics of AI and driverless cars, or even the possibility of how we understand the personal status of strong AI that might exhibit uncanny, rational, and social behavior. What kind of personal status should be ascribed to them? And while these are important topics to consider, I think they often eclipse and shield us from some more fundamental issues happening right now that impacts our personal relationships. I'm talking about the way AI and robotics, more generally, are finding their way into our everyday existences and are getting woven into the fabric of our social lives. Allow me to explain. AI is increasingly used in social media platforms, and hence is mediating the way that we interact online and outside of it. Now, we need to remember that AI is not equated with robotics. Most AI sit on a server somewhere going through large data sets and picking out patterns. So in the case of social media, it might soak through all your friends' statuses and all your likes and retweets to help determine what information to show you in the future. What is important to note is that AI is only as good as the programmers that create the parameters for learning and the data sets it's used to train the AI. The judgments of the programmers make a big difference, and sometimes that can mean the social biases of the programmer, let's be honest, typically white males show up. For example, in 2015, Google apologized after its Google Photos app mistakenly labeled black people as gorillas, likely due to an inadequate data set they used to train it. Brian Barkeen, the black founder of the Miami-based facial recognition company Kairos, recently said coded biases in algorithms meant that such technology should never be used by law enforcement. Facial recognition has largely failed in practice in open environments in the West. In fact, trials in the United Kingdom by police have resulted in almost 91% of cases being false positives to date. Now, we need to be aware of the limitations of present AI, and experts are just beginning to take note that social and political issues are all over the development of AI because of the way we train, develop, and seek to instill our judgments in them. They're not value-free. But let's also consider the area of sociable robotics. Here we have objects that are intentionally created to be seamless with our expectations of what constitutes a person. These robots may have eyes, a human-like face, convey intention through mechanical movements, and have realistic-looking skin. They prey on our inherent propensity to anthropomorphize, and as such, we are captivated by them. Sherry Turkle, an MIT psychologist, has been researching human interactions with these sociable robots for the past 30 years. In one of her more recent books, Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other, Turkle outlines how both children and adults are quick to treat these robots as persons, and her corresponding reservations with how we let them fulfill the role actual humans ought to play in our lives. She gives countless examples of children and adults employing what she calls a functionalist ontology in reference to these sociable robots, in what she refers to as alive enough. Children in her lab will often describe robots as being alive enough to love or mourn, or will say that they are alive enough to be a friend. This troubles Turkle, for she explains that it elucidates a growing, slippery ontological slope in these children's treatment of entities they come across in the world. For example, Turkle recalls a particularly telling scene while she's queuing with her child at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Her child sees two tortoises that have just been shipped all the way from the Galapagos Islands as part of an exhibition on Darwin. Her child bends down and kind of inspects the tortoises and exclaims, "They could have used a robot." Turkle comments that after asking many other children whether they cared that the two tortoises were alive, she concludes that for them, the children in this context seemed to have no intrinsic value. Rather, it was only useful if it had a specific purpose. This functionalist ontology is not only being reflected in the demeanor of children toward these robots, but Turkle finds similar comportment with the elderly. Her research takes her to nursing homes where she will leave for several weeks one of 3 sociable robots that have been on the market. And she finds at first that the elderly are suspicious of these objects and don't know what to do with them. But by the end of only 2 weeks, they have named the robot, asked to keep it, and become severely attached to it. And many describe that they feel less lonely and explain that by the end they are telling the robot their deepest feelings, their fears, and memories. They feel incredibly intimate with them. Well, many robotics creators Turkle encounters speak toward the overall benefits of these sociable robots. The elderly can be assisted with physically moving around their house, be reminded of when to take medication, or can fetch something from the cupboard. The sociable behaviors programmed into the robot help the elderly to use it more intuitively and better, but increasingly they are being marketed as a way to combat loneliness. Turkle is worried that this underlying functionalist ontology has led to human beings compromising their authentic human experience of real relationships with each other. She says, "We seem determined to give human qualities to objects and content to treat each other as things." She tells us that we prefer these less risky and artificial relationships with robots precisely because human relationships are messy. And when it comes down to it, we can have ultimate control over the robot and end our interaction with them whenever we want while still getting that feeling, that buzz of intimacy. Sociable robots gives us the feeling we're being intimate without the risk of a genuinely robust and reciprocal relationship. In the case of the assistive sociable robot, what does it say of our societies and what we think of the elderly or even children, for it's being marketed to them as well, that we are willing to exchange real human cares for an artificial substitute? We can acknowledge the tremendous good that they are in helping the frail be more mobile and in reminding them to do important tasks. But are we okay with them taking care of our parents, grandparents, and even friends' relational and emotional needs as well? These are difficult issues. Let's turn now finally to the last section in my talk. That's just on technological use and personal formation more generally. Probably the kinds of things that each of you have much more experience with in your everyday lives. And it's precisely because of that, perhaps it's more important for all of us here. We don't need to look to sociable robots to understand that our relationships and personal lives are being seriously shaped by technology. In even more mundane but equally radical ways, our use of the internet and mobile phones signals that technology has creeped its way into some of the most personal and intimate spaces. Let's consider the impacts that the internet use and mobile phones is having on our inner lives, and specifically the way our attention becomes a battleground for our personal and moral formation. Nicholas Carr, a renowned technology journalist, wrote a very controversial article in the July and August 2008 edition of The Atlantic entitled, "Is Google Making Us Stupid? What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains." Well, in this article, and in several books he writes later called The Shallows, Carr indicates that our attention has severely diminished due to increased time on the internet. And this has led to shallow reading, and indeed shallow thinking. It's difficult to have a sustained interaction with the text precisely because the form of the internet steers one towards headline reading, emails, and skimming short blogs and essays. He cites one source by the University of College London that looked at the surfing habits of people using the British Library, and they discovered that they were using a form of skimming activity, where people view just one or two pages from an academic site, and then they bounced out, perhaps never to return. This bouncing and skimming activity is indicative of multitasking when on the internet. But if you think multitasking yields greater productivity, think again. According to Stanford social psychologist Clifford Nass, chronic multitaskers have more disordered critical thinking and do worse on every task that they do. But it isn't just our ability to engage deeply with information on the internet that suffers. Again, as MIT psychologist Sherry Turkle claims, our relationships with each other have been affected as well. Turkle has noticed a disturbing trend. Much like the kind of bouncing habits of this UCL study, Turkle has observed that many people cycle through their technology where different windows, virtual spaces, and the real world share the attention of the person, the subject. The issue, as we have seen already with multitasking studies, is that when our attention is not sustained, the quality of that attention is seriously reduced. What is worse, Turkle claims, is that cycling through the different kinds of technology has transmogrified in the past decade into what she terms co-presence. But now, with mobile technology, cycling through has accelerated into the mashup of a life mix. Rapid cycling stabilizes into a sense of continual co-presence. Even a simple mobile phone brings us into the world of continual partial attention. We are always online now, or at least have the ability to be. As a repercussion, we only devote partial attention to whatever is at hand, and these virtual spaces vie for our attention alongside other physical demands from moment to moment. And I think it's precisely these physical demands which is very interesting. The shared attention becomes really egregious in those instances where human beings, particularly those we love, have to compete for our attention in the physical world alongside our interaction in virtual spaces. This is a common feature of modern virtual life, Turkle notes. She has observed that parents check emails, they push strollers. I do it. Children and parents text during family dinners. And she even witnessed a runner texting during a marathon in Italy. Information technology promises to create more time for us to carry out more meaningful tasks, such as being with loved ones. But instead, we have found ways of spending more time with friends and family in which we hardly give them any attention at all. Turkle recounts a particularly sad interview she had with a young child, Audrey. Audrey complains of her mother's inattention when she picks her up at school or after sports practice. At these times, Audrey says her mother is usually focused on her mobile phone, either texting or talking to her friends. Audrey describes the scene. She comes out of the gym exhausted, carrying her heavy gear. Her mother sits in her beaten-up SUV, immersed in her mobile phone, and doesn't even look up until Audrey opens the car door. And sometimes her mother will make eye contact, but remain engrossed with the phone as they begin the drive home. Audrey says, yeah, it gets between us, but it's hopeless. She's not going to give it up. Like it could have been 4 days since I last spoke to her, and then I sit in the car and wait in silence until she's done. Audrey has a fantasy of her mother, waiting for her, expectant, without a phone. I think we can all relate to Audrey and indeed her mother. We are bedazzled by the ease with which we can look up anything on the internet or communicate to others regardless of physical location, and the other activities that we have layered into it in parallel. Indeed, the goods that come along from it. I would not have relationships with my nieces and nephews that live in Los Angeles were it not for this kind of communication technology. But it also comes with sacrifices. I think many of us recognize something has gone awry as well. We are aware of the ploy of advertising to waylay our attention and the click-me culture that seems to have pervaded our contemporary lifestyles. What is more, our interactions with others have suffered because of it. And our loved ones, who are physically before us, are told that they aren't as important as a pithy text from a colleague or the latest online personality quiz from BuzzFeed. Contemporary technological practices on the internet and with our mobile devices have far-ranging consequences for our human capacities in our inner life. So much so that the way in which we interact with information and others online drastically affects our attention and ability to think. As we have seen, this has repercussions beyond our interactions through virtual media. It has even pervaded and structured our lives outside of it as well. Well, you'll no doubt be noting that I've offered little constructive advice on how to deal productively with these areas of technological impact in our lives. I hope you weren't coming for something like that. Even more so, most of my ethical and personal reflection has been provisional, piecemeal, and even limited. This is in due part to the complexity of the issues I've been talking about here. There's no clear silver bullet or technological panacea that is unabashedly positive or negative for that matter. There's probably even technological apps you can get for attention, right? I have them on my laptop, so I don't look at social media. But it's also a feature of this being new territory in some ways. Of course, our personal beliefs, shared history, and tradition provide resources in both understanding the terms of engagement and how to respond well in these times. But often when we venture into new areas like this, we need to turn both to our basic beliefs, religious or otherwise, to take stock of how we've responded to issues like this in the past and to discern the issues in time as well. I've really sought to provide something of the latter here, discerning the issues well, with some initial remarks about ethical and personal appropriation in each area. But if I'm allowed just a few more general remarks, I'll give you a little something, don't worry. I say this is precisely where we need to be talking about these issues more in our communities, for they provide our active, collective memory and can act as the ballast of discernment that is required to respond well in the kinds of issues I've been outlining here. Our local communities help us to perform informed collective action, and together with personal discernment, we might be able to make it through these exciting but often troubling waters. Well, I teach theology and religious studies, so let me provide just a couple of examples of how this might work in practice in the Christian community. Christian reflection on the human person indicates others be treated with inviolable dignity, because they owe their existence to a God who deeply and profoundly cares for them. So applying gene editing techniques to the human person must always and everywhere serve this inherent dignity of the individual, and never treat them as primarily a resource to some other end. But Christians also have a duty of care to relieve suffering wherever it is found, and it's within their power to alleviate or eradicate it. For God is a God of life and healing, who takes human suffering as his own and transforms it. These points of reference and many others like them, going back to our traditions, back to our sources of meaning, become the basis of Christian-informed action with gene editing, and it's incumbent upon Christian churches, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, to collectively seek divine wisdom and then specific application in the area. And as another example, in the case of the social and political impact of technology, we must remember that the Christian church is called to the least of these. Christians believe Christ came for the poor, the orphan, the widow, and disciples of Christ follow his example when their actions promote justice, peace, and abundance to those that are rejected and forgotten by this world. In the context of the issues we have been speaking about, it's worth posing the question, who are the losers in the techno-scientific society, in our techno-scientific economy? Who represents the marginalized? Sadly, it's likely those who are already in politically oppressive regimes, where the strong arm of surveillance represents just another cog in the debilitating machine of corrupt power. It's those that labor without a decent wage, in unsafe factory conditions that produce the very devices in our pockets. And in the case of sociable robotics, it is likely the elderly, the children, and others that aren't seen to be productive members of society who are frail and in need of aid. This is precisely where the Christian church, and indeed all communities that care about the marginalized, can provide such a witness to serve the least of these in this new techno-scientific economy. Finally, we must remember that we are all being shaped by the pressures of technology and AI in each of our lives. No one is exempt. And that this influence stretches not only from the nature of how we work and labor, but even how we communicate and are shaped in our most intimate places personally. Christians care about who each of us becomes. Our personal transformation is at the very heart of the Christian message. But we needn't appeal to just theological, religious, or spiritual sources to care about how we are impacted morally or personally today by technology. We all ought to care about debilitating practices that truncate our interaction with the world and the discourses and habits that suppress our common flourishing together. And the Christian can turn to the church and Christ to learn about how we go about leading exemplary lives in these times of immense change. But others can also turn to their own sources of meaning in their communities of practice to discern how to be human in an age of technology. But it all begins with recognizing that our technological habits and practices shape us personally and morally. And it's time we recognize that and daily ask ourselves, how can I grow into a more virtuous person? And what does it mean to be my best in an age of technology and AI? Thanks.
Do you want to field your own questions? Sorry,
I can field my own questions. How much time do we have? So I know when I'm free.
Yeah, so go for. I mean, if we have them, 20-25.
Okay, sure. Feel free if you need to slip out now before Q&A. Feel free to do so. But does anybody have any questions, comments, reflections, personal confessions?
I might start out.
Okay, Jared can start.
Two things really. So one thing that really stuck out to me, which is probably sort of common sense, I just haven't thought about it before, is the significance of the input into things like AI, which is of course coming from our own bias and prejudices. And so I guess, I mean, is there any sense in which it can be seen, you know, we've talked about the good and the bad and the ups and the downs. If something is sort of increasing prejudice, it seems to me to be inherently something that we should stay away from. So, I mean, what are the ways that we can, I mean, awareness of it, of course, is important, but are there ways that we can utilize AI and that isn't increasing already existing biases within the broader society?
Yeah, I mean, there are certain kinds of things that could essentially identify what those particular patterns and biases are and flag up to the person precisely that these. So one of the big things in AI now is transparency. Essentially, how is it that AI comes to arrive at the kinds of judgments and decisions that it does? Oftentimes this is very difficult to do since we don't actually know how or why it particularly has. But it's precisely that level of transparency of what has the AI been trained on? What kinds of pattern seeking has been imbued into it? And it seems to me that you could maybe even use this AI to flag up precisely those biases for human individuals. So it doesn't have to reinforce them, but it can be an opportunity for us to essentially say, these are biases that you have. What do you do with it? So it turns it back into a kind of human, I think, kind of encounter. And you have a number of organizations who are really kind of looking into providing that kind of resource on top of just the kind of crowdsourcing people's already existing judgments. So transparency, I think, is a good step in that direction. And transparency and not complete autonomy. But I think keeping humans in the loop with that, I think, is absolutely important to see that kind of overall picture. He had his hand up, and then we'll go to the back.
I was just thinking about talking about like the way that AIs are programmed, and I was just thinking how worrying you think it is that probably most of the people who are involved in creating AIs don't believe in spiritual things. I mean, how many Christians or I would probably think there's probably more Muslims involved in creating AI than there are Christians, but I mean, I wonder whether there's any papers or any sort of like. My question is, can we make a spiritual machine?
I mean, I don't know if you've seen this or not, but at least in some German news sources I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, they've made a robotic priest. So Jared, you better make sure you got some backup plans here. No, but these priests that will bless you and provide prayers and things like this, right? Does it concern me? It does concern me in the sense that oftentimes the spiritual, religious, and theological are in the domain of looking at big questions and meaningful questions of, is this right to do? Ought we do it? Because, I mean,
and I'm more thinking of whether or not, so if you create an expert system, and I think there's a lot of terminology, fudging, but if you create an expert system or a system that's meant to aid humanity in some way, shouldn't those systems have this kind of, these kind of big questions, shouldn't these be kind of programmed into them? Or if you program them into them, are they still, are these systems still able to make a moral judgment? So if you have like, we're getting to the point where, let's say for example with mental health or with personal crises, we just don't have the resources to handle those problems on a personal basis. And I imagine that soon there will be, people are already turning, like you mentioned, the BuzzFeed, personality thing. People are turning more and more to the internet to solve their emotional, spiritual, and relational
Yeah.
problems, and so there will be apps coming out that will claim that they can solve your personal problems. And is the fact that any of those things that are being built are probably going to be built on some kind of moral, I don't know what moral foundation those might be built on.
Like the utilitarianism.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you can measure it.
So you might tap into a Facebook group and then go like, okay, so you're having a problem with this girl. Well, look, hey, you've exchanged 25 messages with this person over here. Maybe you should ask her out on a date instead. Not thinking maybe you should actually solve the problem with the person.
Well, and making hard decisions is hard, but the way you do it well is you have lots of different experiences to practice your judgment. And if that is robbed from us, or even in the best of all circumstances, where we keep humans in the loop and we kind of keep humans for those really important judgments, what happens if we get judgmental atrophy? You understand what I'm saying? If essentially we remove so much of our own personal lives, that in and of itself, aside from just looking at the consequential problems, there's also the personal moral part of it. Who we are and the judgments we make are in a lot of ways at the core of what makes us who we are. I choose this thing over that thing. And some of that can be, and the ones that are very, very difficult are often the things that define us most as persons. So even seconding out judgments, how is that going to have certain repercussions on society as a whole as well? Those are good questions. So we had a chap in the back here.
Yeah. Towards the end, you said that we need to have these discussions, and the critical phrase that you used within our local communities. But I think that in the age of technology, the idea of a local community has really become fractured.
Yeah.
And you immediately went from local communities to then discussing how, as Christians, perhaps the lens through which you would view a lot of these issues. But that already is not exactly a local community. And with some of these issues, if we look at how we're going to approach things like social media, that's something that you can do on an individual basis, on a family basis, that sort of thing. But some of the other issues, like gene editing, is something that can't exactly be tackled locally.
Absolutely.
I was wondering if you could say more about how you expect humanity to come up with solutions to these things that inevitably involve the entire global community.
Yeah, likely it's both, right? But let's take the case of gene editing, right? We had the global summit a couple of years ago, the moratorium on human germline modification. And that's probably, I think, the best you're going to get in terms of an actual international mandate in terms of, you can't get more clear-cut than scientists saying, yes, we shouldn't do this. But you still get things that happen, in kind of local geographies, things like this. And I think that's where the impact it can make has to be at the kind of local level of making people feel that they're responsible for it. So I think it has to be a combination, and I think it's the classic case of if we try to take too much on, that's, I think, part of that kind of psychology is much harder to do. Thinking in terms of we're all human beings, but if I can be this person who's sitting down next to me, we're much more psychologically primed to be able to actually make a difference, I think, in just our own locality than we are as a whole. Now, the way that those local communities and localities are connected together into an international global village, as someone like Buckminster Fuller would say in the 1960s, is absolutely important and imperative. So I think it has to be a kind of combination of both. But I think precisely this kind of top-down, one-size-fits-all actually ruins precisely our kind of individual, our individuality when it comes to our appropriation of that. And precisely the way that certain things like that policy just isn't going to fly here. Because we're different. We adjudicate things differently here, you know. And how does that, you know, work its way out? And thankfully, this is, you know, we have a means of mobilization that deals with this already in its politics. And this is why it's very sad that it seems so much of our trust in each other is eroding precisely during a time when we might be giving more of our judgments over to things we don't know how they're making their choices. I don't know, far left.
Yeah, thank you. When you talked about how the values of Christianity specifically might help people make decisions in these very complex scenarios, it seemed to me like a lot of the Christian values that you point out are shared by non-Christians as well. So could you emphasize what exactly it is about Christianity which may provide some clarity in these decisions?
I mean, in one sense, I wanted it to be influential enough for those that don't have a particular faith background to gain something, you know, from this. I mean, the title of the talk is Being Human in an Age of Technology. At least, although, I mean, you ask transhumanists, and they might say, like, actually being human is a pretty bad thing. So maybe we can't all agree that being human is a very good thing. But a lot of us can. I think the further in you get, the more particular you get with certain Christian distinctives, you then start to like lose particular appeals when one doesn't have a kind of divine authority that you don't equally subscribe to. So I might say something like prayer of discernment, that if one is a Christian, one recognizes that God is active, and He's active in this world, bringing about His ends and His means for His creation in each individual person. And it's not some kind of deistic God removed from all of reality, but He has given us His Holy Spirit, the Comforter, one who provides precisely that inspiration and discernment. So I might say something like, the Holy Spirit, you better start praying. That's distinctive. How about here?
Are you aware of, so I'm wondering, are you aware of research that covers the intersection between algorithmic bias and human bias? Because I think it's widely acknowledged that there is such thing as algorithmic bias. However, I wonder how it performs compared to human bias. For instance, it is known that judges are subject to making harsher decisions before having lunch, which is one example of bias in human decisions. So is there anything that, are you aware of anything that is concerned with this issue?
It's certainly a very good question. I'm not aware of anything that does it in an exhaustive way, and I think it's precisely that exhaustion. How do you measure precisely the inadequacies, right, of AI deficiencies versus something like cognitive deficiencies or biases, right? And how do you adjudicate the particular impact of both of those? And then but the thing is, it's never going to be, well, in this case, we need AI judges. Very likely it's going to be some combination of judges who have an AI assistant who can precisely flag up, hey, you're hungry, your glucose level's a little low, eat some food, man, you know? And also, hey, here's all the particular cases that are relevant to, you know, what it is that you're looking at, you know, to be able to make the kinds of judgment that you need. So most of, I think, the kind of future applications are precisely going to be in and around the kind of interactions where the algorithmic biases can be alleviated by human capabilities, and human deficiencies can be helped by algorithmic. So what we do good, we can help each other. Goodness, more people. Yes, you in the...
Following from this question, I think, for example, as we proved by research, the majority, for example, like car accidents happens by because of human mistakes. And these mistakes are usually coming from either not our human brain not being able to process, to recognize all the inputs and putting them together in real time to give the correct input. And at the same time, we have emotional inputs coming in that don't come in machines, for example. So what about seeing AIs as an improvement in a sort of in certain fields where emotional interactions are a flaw? Because in certain situations, our humanity is not actually an extra adding value to the situation, but sometimes it's actually taking away. It's kind of it's a flaw in certain situations. Sometimes because we are in a way biological machines programmed to interact with environment, and in a way we are still animals. We still have all this chemical interaction inside our bodies. We are originally made to defend from the environment. So for example, fear or rush of adrenaline that's supposed to make us run faster from the lion that is chasing us. So in certain situations in the modern world where we live in, and where often we don't have to run away from the lion, this kind of biological leftovers that we have become flaws. So why are we actually so concerned about having non-emotional, non-spiritual machines when in lots of situations that's actually an advantage?
Yeah, so I think the problem becomes when those particular moral decisions aren't accompanied by particular emotions that are, at least in certain kinds of ethical theories, imperative to our understanding of what makes that proper. So for instance, something like, let's go to this particular case of a judge, right, where we could have an AI. There's something captured, I think, with a human being that rightly, who's been able to, I don't want to say tame the particular emotions, but has the proper emotional responses to the kinds of judgments we have. So it's not that it necessarily gets in the way, but it provides a particular kind of imperative, empathy, things like this that we think are absolutely imperative to being a good judge. I want a judge to be empathetic. I also want them to be just. So it's not about the eradication of a particular emotion, but it's about the right ordering of that emotion to the intellectual acts. And I think that actually AI could potentially help with something like that. All right, how many more? How about Tim down here in the front?
Thank you. Kierkegaard introduced the concept of an infinite passion.
Yeah.
And of course we can all understand that if the internet crashes, our infinite passion is gone. But he of course had in mind an infinite passion for a transcendent being that actually couldn't be brought ultimately within the realm of immanence and availability to human beings. And I wonder therefore if one critique of technology is that is in terms of availability and disposability, and the more of those things are given to us, actually the less human we become, precisely because our finitude is concealed from us. And that might bring together these spiritual and non-spiritual elements, because we can then define transcendence as we wish in terms of a personal God or something else. But this is a Heideggerian critique, really, but this idea of endless disposability to us, that is, it seems to be a good, but actually is reducing our humanity.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is the ability to be somehow arrested by something which is not under one's control actually is incredibly human and fulfilling. That when something is under one's control, therefore one can't assign it ultimate meaning, right? Because it's under our control. I'm quite privy to that kind of Tillichian, Kierkegaardian, account itself. But that says more to do with subjectivity in the modern condition, and some might say is at the heart of technological mastery itself as well. That we will never be fulfilled precisely because there isn't something that we set up as being, or that claims authority over us. All right, one more question. Lady in the back with the glasses.
I was wondering about the concept you talked about being alive enough.
Yeah.
Compared to that idea of a sort of inherent human dignity and the kind of respect and treatment that we think that warrants of other human beings. Do you think that if we start to consider robots alive enough or have a level of value within themselves, that they'll then deserve a level of protection or have a level of responsibility for the actions they carry out, particularly when we control them, who is responsible for them and the kind of what value we place in that way?
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is, it's not a problem if really robust artificial intelligence, robots that actually have, artificial general intelligence, actually have some personal status. It's not as big of a problem to say that they're alive enough. In the same kind of way we might say, your cat Dorcas, is alive enough for you to love, or something like this. So we could get into all kinds of issues around the great chain of being and, how we love things in the right ways for the capabilities that they have, but then how do we adjudicate artificial beings on that? Well, the case is still out, and I have, until that's been solved, I'll wait until that actually happens to respond to that question.
Read Asimov.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for coming here tonight and listening to this talk, and thank you all.